see anyone out there, so hopefully you're all in a good spot and can see me. Welcome this evening. My name is Erin Kelley. I work for an organization called Spirit and Place. We're part of the IU School of Liberal Arts at Iacoucci, and it's my pleasure to be facilitating tonight's dialogue. Before we dive into the dialogue, I do want to say a few words about this term dialogue that I'm using. Oftentimes we use the words dialogue, discussion, and conversation interchangeably. We seem to understand that debate is its own thing. That's winners and losers, right or wrong. I'm going to convince you of my point of view. But actually, dialogue, discussion, and conversation have their own unique meanings as well. Conversation is about expressing opinions and ideas. Discussion is oftentimes rooted in trying to find a solution, trying to work towards some kind of goal. Dialogue is different from that. While we engage in dialogue, we might very well be sharing our own opinions and expressing our points of view. We might actually have in the back of our mind some sort of long-term goal or solution that we want to achieve. But first and foremost, dialogue is about listening. It is about trying to understand that someone has a different point of view from mine. Doesn't mean I'm going to agree with them, but it means it's important to listen and to seek empathy, right? So dialogue is about leaning into a sense of adventurous civility. It's about understanding that life is messy, and that some of the issues that we're talking about are complex. And we don't necessarily need to run away from disagreement. It's okay to disagree, but it's never okay to deny someone their lived reality or to dismiss their story because it challenges our own. Because when you deny someone their humanity, that's just never right. So tonight we're going to engage in dialogue, and the panelists we've all met over Zoom earlier. We've also had some individual phone conversations. We have also come to some community agreements about what will guide this dialogue, and I hope you will embrace these community agreements too when we get to the Q&A portion of things. First and foremost, we agree to be respectful, pretty basic one. We agree to meet each other where we are. That is, we're each coming to this from our own unique points of view, from our own lived experiences, and we're going to respect that. We're going to listen to understand before speaking to be understood. There are no racial slurs or derogatory names, period. And we're going to give space and take space, which is a nice way of saying we're going to be careful about how much time we're using when we're speaking. And then we're going to embrace this space, literal space right now, as a brave space. Because again, talking about racism is hard, it's uncomfortable, and it's awkward. And we need to be brave in that space. We need to understand that sometimes we're going to be challenged, we might hear things we don't agree with, but if we immediately react with a sense of defensiveness, we're not moving the ball forward. So it's important to be brave in these spaces. So we do have three panelists tonight. One of whom is...
She's getting mine.
She's what?
Gina is getting mine.
Gina is getting mine. Here we go. Okay. So we have three panelists tonight. They are in your programs. One of the panelists, Mike Finnegan, unfortunately could not be here this evening. He had a family emergency. But we are pleased to welcome Reverend Franklin, who is an ordained minister holding degrees from Purdue, Butler, and Destiny Christian Universities. Besides her ministry work with Evangel Church in Greenfield, she's also helped establish a daycare and preschool ministry in Hawville, which is a near West Side Indianapolis community where my family actually originates. So that was just a wonderful thing to discover about Reverend Franklin. Brent Eaton currently is your Hancock County Prosecutor. Brent was initially elected in 2015. He's got a law degree from the Iacoucci School at Iacoucci. And Brent's community service includes serving on boards of the Land Teen Recovery Program and Zoe's Place Child Advocacy Center. He serves on a variety of councils and commissions connected to local law enforcement as well. And then our other speaker, who is getting mic'd, Gina Iacoucci, is with New Palestine High School, and she has been teaching Just Mercy in her classroom. So she's going to be able to bring a perspective to us about what some young people think about this book and movie. And we're going to give Gina just a second here, see if she gets mic'd.
All right.
There we go. Okay. Here's Gina. So please welcome our guest, make them feel like beloved. Okay. Are we all ready? Okay. So prior to this evening, I sent our panelists an excerpt from the book Just Mercy, which also, I believe, helps to close out the film in one of the final scenes. And I asked them simply to reflect on this excerpt from the book. And I'm going to read it to you, and then we're going to talk about it. Proximity has taught me some basic, humbling truths, including this vital lesson. Each of us is more than the worst things we've ever done. My work with the poor and the incarcerated has persuaded me that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. Finally, I've come to believe that the true measure of our commitment to justice, the character of our society, our commitment to the rule of law, fairness, and equality cannot be measured by how we treat the rich, the powerful, the privileged. The true measure of our character is how we treat the poor, the disfavored, the accused, the incarcerated, and the condemned. So thinking just about that statement, just that part of the book, and I'm going to start with you, Reverend Franklin, if I can. What does that spark in you? What does that passage spark in you? What resonates to you?
Well, it causes you to really think and weigh the issues at hand. I know this is one of the excerpts taken from the book, but when Brian made the statement, opposite of poverty is justice. And when you think about poverty, many times people lock it into just money, but we can be poor in spirit, we can be poor in hope, we can be poor in goals. Poverty has a range, and but it begets there being some justice that can help us get out of whatever poverty that we might be locked into. And I believe Brian was hoping that we would even broaden the term there. And I know that part of the book, it touched so many times that some of the people that are incarcerated, many of them are poor, and the majority of those are people of color. And poor being not having enough funds, or not even having, sometimes poor in the education manner to even know how to go through the steps to get help and to get legal advice. So that's what this statement basically summed up to be the opposite of poverty is justice. So justice begins when we're born, okay? And all the stages of life that a person has to go through to even step out of the realm of poverty and into the realm of what should be.
What should be, yeah. Brent, for you, what did that excerpt from the book spark in you? What did it make you think about?
A lot of things. I agree with the Reverend that the definition of poverty, I think, is more broad than what most would anticipate. And it's absolutely true that it extends far beyond financial or material needs and can extend into being poor of spirit or poor of hope. And one of the things that really is one of the more difficult portions of the job I have presently is that, when people are poor of spirit and poor of hope, then it seems that they are more likely to fall into situations where they may have difficulty with mental health, where they may have difficulty with substance abuse, and then you get a downfall into criminal activity, and a lot of they can be incarcerated or worse as a result of those things. And so hope is important. Hope's really important. And one of the things that in my work with the Direct Board and in helping people obtain the path of sobriety is one of the consistent threads of people who are able to move away from substance abuse is the ability to have hope. One of the things also that stood out, and as a prosecutor, we don't try to hurt and punish bad people, we punish bad acts. And in fact, we're kind of bound to make sure that when we talk to juries that the only thing we want them to consider is the law and the facts. And that's the only thing we want them to look at. And I know we work very hard to ensure that that's what we do.
Thank you. Gina, how about you? And I'm curious too with you if that particular excerpt from the book was anything that maybe came up in the classroom. So if you want to share anything that your students maybe said when you discussed this idea of poverty and the opposite of poverty, if there's anything there to share.
Well, I think that excerpt that you picked is really telling to why this book fits so well into a classroom. So the reason that I think that this book is such a good book for us to read is because it really gets to a point that students, wherever they are in the political spectrum, can all agree on. The fact, we learn in government about major principles in government, like the rule of law, and that everyone should be treated fairly under the law. And so if you have a justice system where people are treated differently based purely on their race or based on their amount of wealth, then that's not a fair system, and it's really easy for students to see that that is a problem. I think the excerpt that you picked also, kind of like what they said, gets to the point of that people are better than their worst acts, and the importance of having mercy with one another. That's something that high school students can get on board with right away, because they're people that, are teenagers, and they don't want to ever be defined by the worst thing that they ever did, and so they get more emotionally involved in the book, thinking about the fact that we need to have mercy for each other in general in life, and also mercy for each other in the justice system.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. So I like this. I mean, what I'm hearing from all of you is that we need to think more broadly about this concept of poverty, where it emanates from and what it means and how it plays out in our life, and that values like fairness and mercy resonate across age groups, across political spectrums, that these are maybe some shared values that we can root these conversations in, and that there is some group. Did you have something to share?
Yeah, just a little bit. I mean, in line with that, within the last year and a half or so, with all the COVID situation, one of the real challenges with the advent of technology and with so many things being different now than they were 30 or 40 years ago, you don't have as much of a social connection, okay? And a lot of those soft social structures that people traditionally would have, and the church or the different social clubs or different things that they would encounter, well, okay, they were already frayed, and when you have government orders, you're supposed to stay inside or different things, and it really, really stretches them. And so, I think that they've been really damaging, and the social isolation that occurred as a result of that has been really damaging to a lot of people that would be in poverty of spirit and hope. And it's been something that really, we honestly have been struggling with, because it's really, when people feel isolated, they feel hopeless, and they're more likely to engage in the behavior we discussed before.
Thank you. So I want to move on and ask each of you some questions that are more rooted in your personal professional experiences, because part of the reason you were asked to be on this panel tonight was because we could bring different perspectives to the table. So, Reverend Franklin, in your bio, you write that you are simply a black mother, a black grandmother, and a black great-grandmother who knows the pain and fear both within your own African-American community and the division overall in the local community. Now, when we first met over Zoom last month to get to know each other, I asked you all what stood out to you most about the story of Just Mercy, and the first word out of your mouth was terror. That's what resonated with you, the terror that Walter and his family must have felt when they realized that no one was going to listen to their truth.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I've heard folks, the Legal Women Voters, tell me that you spoke last summer at a rally for racial justice, a Unite to Pray rally that some local ministers put together, and you're obviously here speaking tonight. So what truth do you want this audience to hear about your experiences, and why now? Why you're speaking out now for your children and your grandchildren and others?
My pastor, I'm a member of the Evangel church here in to burn my heart last year after the murder of George Floyd, and the anger and the riots and everything we all know that was happening not only here in our nation but in other parts of the world. And as a Christian, we know that we should zero in and be praying. But all people needed, had a heart, all people needed to come together, the law enforcement, the legal realm, even churches of different denominations. There needed to be a desire to unite and focus and zero in on what issues were and pray about them so that this thing could be stopped. There's a scripture, and may I say that since I'm a reverend, in 2 Chronicles it says, if my people, which are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face. God's talking about his people, Christians, and seek his face and turn from their wicked ways. I mean, that has to resonate that God is asking his people to turn from their wicked ways. He said, then when we pray, he will hear from heaven, he'll forgive our sins, and he'll heal our land. So I feel like because pastors are zeroing in and calling different prayer meetings or churches that have perpetual prayer on Tuesdays or Wednesdays, racism and systemic racism has been on one of the items of the prayer meetings. If we'll repent and pray, a great deal of solution lies on the shoulders of the body of Christ to seek God for peace. And even peace comes about by situations like this, merely dialogue so that we can have understanding. The scripture says in Proverbs, wisdom is the principal thing, and in all thy getting, get understanding. And I think that's what dialogue brings about to a great deal is understanding.
So, but besides, I mean, for people of faith, obviously, prayer is very important, and using scripture is very important to make sense of the world and to face these issues. But what else are you or your congregation doing right now to try to bring about awareness or create understanding or create and foster deeper dialogue about race in this community?
Prayer. We're praying. And we're communicating. Our church, we have an unusual church, so we communicate well. It's a small church, small body, but we haven't begun to do anything. The beginning was last year at the Unite to Pray. And also in that you mentioned my, as a mother, grandmother, I was asked to speak to, my pastor asked me to speak to the anger that people must have felt because of, the rioting. And, and I made the point, maybe, do I have time to make it now?
Yep.
Okay. That I have grandchildren, and one grandson is dark brown skin, and one is mixed, and he's fair, and he would be mistaken as white, if they were together. That one I don't worry about, but my dark brown grandson, I'm worried about. He works at a fast food place. He's 20, but and he doesn't live near me. But I said, how are you getting to work? And I said, are you getting on the bus? He said, oh, it's just about 8 blocks away. I'm walking. I said, no, because he's beside the early morning shift. I said, why are you walking? I said, please ride the bus. And so I still, because of the uprising of racism, it comes around ever so often, every something big happens. And our antennas go up. And as a mother and grandmother, many, just in conversation, that extra warning goes out like, he's not 5, I'm walking alone to the neighborhood school. He's a grown man going to a job. Whether he's walking or riding the bus or driving a car, the fear is there. What do you do? I mean, I'm sorry our law officer isn't here, but has our nation gotten any rules out there to tell us what do we do when the police stop a black man? Do you put your hands out the window? Do you put them on the steering wheel? Do you lean on the dashboard? Do you reach for your registration? I mean, if you raise your hands like this in the car, your phone might flick and they think you got a gun, or the light might reflect off your jewelry. So what do we do? This is a crazy time, and there needs to be broadly the law, enforcement industry needs to have set rules that are the same in every state.
Thank you for sharing that. And I do just want to reiterate for the audience, we originally had another panelist this evening who was a 26-year veteran of the police force, Mike Kinnigan, who I'd hoped to talk to him tonight about what it's like walking in two worlds. He's a black man and a former police officer, so it's talking about someone who literally walks in two worlds every day. And in other conversations that I had with Mike leading up to tonight, he relayed to me stories he's had with profiling, with walking into a store and not being first seen as a law enforcement officer, but as a black man who gets followed around. But on the flip side, knowing, experiencing that a routine traffic stop can go in a wildly different direction, and he has to be continually prepared for that. And one of the things, and I do wish you were here tonight, Mike and I had talked about, was the importance of using forums like these as an opportunity to break down myths. Particularly for him, myths about blackness and myths about law enforcement. Because he talked to Reverend Franklin about this idea of fear and how much fear exists and that there is such a lack of understanding. And I'm actually going to throw this to Gina, though, because I'm wondering in the conversations you've been having with young people based on this book, if any myths have emerged that you have found that young people need to grapple with, or any other misconceptions or anything fear-based about the legal system that you're finding yourself now talking about with your class, particularly considering the uprisings that happened last summer.
Well, I guess the first big myth that came up when we were reading the book was really about the death penalty, because a lot of the book is obviously focused on the death penalty. And right off the bat, my students asked me how many people really were on death row, because they had the impression that it was not a large number at all. And so we did some research together, and while the number of people on death row for federal crimes is relatively low, there is quite a large number on death row for state crimes. So that's kind of like a myth that we talked about when we first started the book. Otherwise, I think that it's really easy for students to hear things and think, hear stories about things that have happened to people or unfairness in the justice system and think that there's no way that that could happen to them or somebody that they know. But the book does a really nice job of telling these people's stories in a way that makes students feel like they can relate and understand why people's backgrounds are so important to understand when it comes to their sentencing. I would assume that most people have read Just Mercy.
Out of curiosity, not that we can see that well, how many people in the audience have read the book as well as watched the video? I'm seeing quite a few hands. Great.
So obviously Walter's story is extremely compelling, and you get really frustrated, for Walter because of all the evidence that proves his innocence. But I really thought that the most compelling parts of the book were the chapters in between Walter's story, where it talks about people who are children who are put on death row or given life sentences, or people that grew up with really horrible experiences in the foster care system or battling with mental health issues. And so I think that helps students really understand the issues because it gives them more of a personal place to come from to understand those things.
Thank you. Now, Brent, I want to ask you, when and Reverend Franklin mentioned this too, there's anger. And I know when the first time we talked, one of the things about the book that really struck you was it angered you. It angered you that there were so many failures in Walter McMillan, Johnny D's case. That
I might have used a more colorful word.
Might use a more colorful word now. He was very angry. And part of the reason you were angry, I'd say the main reason you were angry, is that the systems at play not only let down Walter McMillan and his family, they let that community down because
they let down the victim's family.
They let down the victim's family.
Yeah.
The person who perpetrated the crime walked free, likely committed other crimes. So there's a huge amount of failure going on in that community. But it also failed in a larger sense because it added to the disproportionality of Black Americans entering the prison system. It added to mass
It
incarceration.
certainly did not help the credibility of the justice system.
And
It
it
certainly
did
did not do that.
No, it definitely hurt the credibility of the justice system. So, and it added to the real fear that families like Reverend Franklin fear, for the people for their family members. So there's a lot of pain and anger out there. We can all, I think, acknowledge that and see that and feel that. But this is your community. You are their elected prosecutor. So I think this community would particularly like to hear from you about any efforts you and your office are taking to address any blind spots that might exist to ensure that justice, that fairness that is so important to Gina's students is being served within the Hancock County Prosecutor's Office.
It's a big question. Well, we work really closely with our partners in law enforcement, in the Sheriff's Department, the police departments around the community. One of the things that really is everybody's been pretty aggressive about locally is the use of technology to bring forth transparency. And in that regard, the use of cameras in the vehicles, the cameras on the body, on the body of the officer's body cams, and then when there is a situation where we have to review what occurred, we don't really have to guess. We can look, we can see, and when you have to guess based upon things where you're much less likely to get the answer right than it is when you can see it. And so I really commend Sheriff Burkhardt and Chief Rash for the work that they've done on technology, because I think that that transparency helps everyone. It certainly helps when there's questions about what's happened on a traffic stop, both from the perspective of the officer, if there's been an accusation of conduct against him, or the alternative, if there's concerns about what the officer's done relative to the rights of the person who stopped. And so, the technology is really something that makes our job, I think, a lot more effective. And so that's something that, really is really a lot of credit to Chief Rash and Sheriff Burkhardt for helping us to bring those things on, and for other law enforcement officers and for other agencies around the county. It's a big investment, but the investment's well worthwhile. The other one is that we talk about actually internally in our office, is that it's always right to do the right thing, right? It's always right to do the right thing. And so, that means being mindful of our obligations under Brady. That means being mindful of our obligations about, evidence which may be harmful to our case, and make sure we consider those things and disclose things appropriately, and just make sure we do things right. I mean, one of the things that we talk about internally is that the credibility that's been granted to us in the prosecutor's office is something that, is really difficult to win and to have, and really easy to lose. And so, the cornerstone of the justice system in our community has to be the credibility that we have, that people will have confidence that we're going to do everything we can to make sure that we get it right. Which, kind of dovetails back to the original question regarding the McMillan case and the frustration, about the manner in which, in that situation, it wasn't done right, and the disappointment that I expressed to you back when we talked about it in the beginning.
Thank you. Okay, so I do want to dive into and sort of address, I don't know if it's the elephant in the room, but it's certainly part of the reason we are all here tonight. A large part of the reason we're here, why the League of Women Voters in Hancock County wanted to put all of this together, is because of the outrage that was expressed last summer at the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Now, the officer in that killing, Derek Chauvin, has been convicted. Yet during the course of Chauvin's trial, there were 65 officer-involved shooting deaths in this country. And within 24 hours of the verdict, there were 6 citizen fatalities involving law enforcement. Now, regardless of the circumstances surrounding those individual cases, which involved both black and white victims, those numbers are staggering and painful and sad, right? I think we can always agree that when a law enforcement officer takes a civilian life, that is a sad and tragic occurrence. Now, one of the conversations that I had with Mike Kittigan, who couldn't be here tonight, he asked a question that I wanted to ask of you guys related to all of this. What does society want? What do we want of, and this is maybe a rhetorical question for the audience too to think about, okay? What do we want from our law enforcement officers? What do we want from our criminal justice system? What do we want from the systems, from education to mental health care, to poverty assistance? What do we want as a society that would better support all of us so that we can change things, so that this country is no longer a country where on average 1,000 civilians are killed a year in law enforcement encounters? I know that's a big question, and that might take a minute to sit on here, right? But I think it's a powerful question, because we are society, we are community. What do we want? We're living in a system that is tragic and sad and violent and fearful. But what the heck do we want in order to fix that? I'll give you a moment to think about that.
Just one?
Oh, I know there's more than one, yeah.
I think what I began to mention about there needs to be consistency in what's expected of the citizens when we're stopped by a police officer, like in a traffic situation, or it just needs to be consistent so that the law enforcement officers aren't taken off guard, and neither are the citizens. Whether it's a traffic stop or maybe if the police are called maybe to a scene where there's an accident or robbery maybe, and the person is still there. And it just needs to be a consistent step by step. I'm sure there are some on the books, but somewhere along the way people got loose, they got raggedy, and so if I travel from one state to the next, what's expected of me there? I think there needs to be national consistency. But your question is loaded. That was a lot.
Don't run.
I'm sorry?
Don't run.
Okay.
Don't fight. Okay? Don't. The statistics are very clear. Is that the probability of an incident as you described occurring skyrockets when you run and when you fight. If you believe that there is an issue, and if you are stopped and you believe it's not just, okay, it's probably on camera, right? It's going to be recorded. We're going to know what happened. And so the time when we have an argument isn't there. It's not. It's not.
Sometimes it doesn't matter.
Well, it matters. Don't run and don't fight.
But there are cases where people haven't run and they have still been shot and still been killed. And I think that's where Reverend Franklin is getting to, with some sort of consistency in terms of not only how the public should act, but what we should expect from law enforcement in those instances.
Sure.
And I'm wondering, do we need better training? Do we need to deploy others into situations with law enforcement officers who can help de-escalate these kinds of things?
Well, I'm really proud of Hancock County again, and working with Chief Rash and with Sheriff Burkhardt and with the other agencies in our community. We're fortunate enough to be one of the first communities where we've had a majority of our officers be critical incident training.
CIT training.
The CIT. And they've gone through that so they understand it, and they've all learned the de-escalation skills in large part. We kind of got messed up by COVID, and that kind of messed up our training. But that way, they learn the skills to try to de-escalate situations, and to try to find ways so that there is a lesser probability of there being a violent incident, de-escalating with their words or their actions or how they approach things, or trying to figure out, learn, and ascertain what's going on. Potentially there's a mental health issue. There's all kinds of things you can learn, which you can make it less likely that there's violent confrontation. No police officer sits up and goes to work and thinks, today is the day that I want to pull the trigger and end somebody's life. Nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants that to happen. And on the one side, I empathize with the concerns that you've expressed about the very real stress that she has for people in her family. And I empathize with what she says. Simultaneously, at the same time, there's also, unfortunately, there's nationwide, there's been, incidents of violence against law enforcement. Relatively recently, there was a law enforcement officer in New York who was in the city when he got shot while he was in his car. And these incidents occur on the other side, too. And so, technology is in this instance, is a wonderful thing because it helps bring transparency. Transparency, I think, can breed trust. And, you know, before I was prosecutor, I was in the car and I've been stopped before when I was, young, and I got stopped in the car. And you don't run, you don't fight, don't do it.
Reverend Franklin.
Don't escalate the situation, don't do it.
I agree. I've heard that before, don't run. But here's a question that I think a lot of people have. If people do run, why are they shot in the back rather than the legs? Is there a reason that...
Because you don't have, when they're the way...
If they're running away from you and their back is to you. I mean, in the old cowboy plays, they would make a man, cowboys, would turn and face each other and draw guns, okay? That was given no respect, but if a person runs, and I'm not saying they should, and the officer feels the need to shoot, I don't understand why the torso is being shot at, or the head, versus the legs. This is horrible to say, but look at Aubrey. Those two men shot him in his legs when he was jogging, and he fell. He didn't have a gun or anything, but it still disabled him from getting away from them.
They're not trained to shoot the legs.
Well, I'm saying there needs to be training.
The only reason that they would unholster a weapon and discharge the weapon is because they would see what they perceive to be a threat. And then they're trained to go for center mass. And the other issue is when they discharge a weapon, they don't want to miss and hit something else or somebody else.
But I think that gets to the question then, as a society, is that what we want training to be? To aim for the torso, aim for the head? Do we want a society in which
I think all
law
of us would agree, we
enforcement...
don't want them to have to shoot anybody.
No, I know, but we do have a system at play where, unfortunately, and I feel for the officers in this situation, I really do, but an average of 1,000 civilians a year are killed by law enforcement. Just because you run shouldn't be a death sentence. So when I ask that question as a society, what do we want? I think that's one of the questions we have to wrestle with. Is that what we want? And if it's not what we want, I don't think anyone wants that, then how do we shape a different system that doesn't make it okay for this many, police civilian deaths to occur?
It needs to be published more often. What people need to be aware. Even reading the book, I'm so much more aware of everything, including issues of surrounding, like the young lady said here about the children being on death row until, Brian went to the Supreme Court. Children 12, 13, 14 being housed in prisons with older people where the children were molested and so forth. And that's something the average individual doesn't think about unless it affects somebody in their family, or somebody close by. So I think what we're doing today is talking about it, and I hope the people that are here will talk to others about it. And I think something will be done about some of the issues. That's what we want, not just to talk, but then somebody to take the ball and run with it.
Gina, do your students get into any of these conversations while reading the book?
Yeah, I really like what the Reverend said about consistency. I think that that's a really good word for what my students would like to see. Consistency in how law is upheld and consistency in how sentences are given. And I also like what Prosecutor Eaton said about transparency. That's another thing that my students really want to see. And I think that use of body cams is really helping with transparency. And I also think that education can play a big role too, because maybe there should be more of an emphasis on teaching students or kids how to react when they are pulled over. Because I'd say half of my students said that their parents talked to them about that, and half of them said that their parents maybe didn't talk to them about that. But then in those chapters in the book, there's other really practical things that students can lobby for. I'm teaching 18-year-olds, so they're going to be voting soon. I hope that a lot of them are going to go out to the community and advocate for things that they care about. And there's things that get brought up in the book that students can advocate for. For example, maybe more support for defense attorneys, because it seems like a lot of the defense attorneys have a lot on their plate in the book and aren't able to ensuring that juveniles are not charged as adults up to a certain age. Those are all things that I think my students could advocate for once they start voting or, use their voice to advocate for those things.
I'm glad you brought up the idea about the defense attorneys, because something interesting that I learned in this process from Brent was, maybe you'd like to share with the audience what Indiana requires of people who are facing a death row sentence and they are appointed a defense attorney. You were talking about how Indiana has
Yeah, I got excited again when we talked about that. That was another thing I got animated about. It is that in Indiana, if you're appointed, if there is a case where the defendant's facing life without parole or death penalty, which is the same statute, then the attorney that would be appointed by the court is somebody who has to be death penalty qualified. And what that specifically means is that there's a certain number of criminal trials that they would have had to have gone through to verdict, and you have to go through a certain number of those so that then you can be murder qualified, and then you've had to go through a certain number of those. In addition, you've had to have additional training to where then, you're particularly experiencing death penalty litigation, and the issues that are presented therewith. And one of the things that's, I think maybe the public, it's unlikely they would know, is that the people that engage in that work from the State Public Defender's Office, they do that all the time. And so it's something where they're very aggressive and gifted litigators in their chosen field. And that there's some of the more talented attorneys in the state of Indiana that do those kind of cases for the defense. And so that was something that really stood out as a key difference in my experience in working in the justice system here in Indiana versus what was portrayed in the film and the book that is at issue today. And so, I think it'd be really, really difficult to go out and really outside of more or less outlandish amount of money to have a defense which would be better than the one that could be provided by virtue of the state public defenders and the work that they do on these subjects. And so, the result of that is that if there's going to be a successful prosecution for a crime resulting in a life without parole or death penalty sentence, well then the burden on the state will be heavy, and the litigation, and the defense on the other side is going to be competent, is going to be well qualified, and is going to be aggressive.
But that is an Indiana requirement that Indiana puts on.
Yes, that's correct. I'm not licensed elsewhere.
No. But I was glad to hear that. But it also kind of reiterates Reverend Franklin's point is that we have a federalist system, right? States get to design their own laws, but that does lead to some inconsistency then, from what I understand about states.
It was really startling in the book to learn, basically what the record reflected and occurred at the trial level, with the defense and some of the cases that were discussed. It was really, the system works well when everyone does their job well. One of the things that as prosecutors we really want to work hard to do is ensure that if we have a case and a case goes to trial, I've had a number of cases that have been relatively high profile, we've had to go to trial. Okay, we want to do it once. We don't want to do it again. And we want to do everything we can to make sure that the record's strong, the record's clear, that any court that comes back and look at things later is going to think everything was above board, everything was on point. And, when you have good defense work, it helps us to achieve having a good record and a just record.
So I know we have some audience questions, but before we get to some of those questions, I want to just ask all of you, where do you want to see the most change occur in the criminal justice system, especially when it comes to racial disparities and inequality?
I would like to see mass incarceration re-examined, where it's been privatized and people are sent to prison because there's $1 on their head. Somebody at some top somewhere is making money off of people that are like cattle being herded through the legal system. Sometimes, some places, not every place, but I would like to see that examined across the nation.
And I think an important statistic to share on that, in case the audience doesn't know, but in the United States, we lead the developed world in terms of those that are incarcerated. The United States, I think, makes up 5% of the global population, yet incarcerates 25% of the world's incarcerated individuals.
That was stunning on the fact sheet.
Anyone else? What is the major change you'd like to see in the criminal justice system to create that more fair system that your students, Gina, say that they want to see for all?
I'm not an expert on some of this stuff, so I'll just say what I'm thinking. I think that I would like to see more, just from things that I learned in the book, more consideration for the background of defendants when they're on trial, because I know that victims get to make an impact statement, and that helps with sentencing, or it's taken into consideration during sentencing. But I think that there was a lot of people in the book that came from really impactful backgrounds that led them to where they were, and I wish that there was more consideration for those circumstances.
Brent, what about you?
A few things. I'm a note taker, and so I take a lot of notes. One thing that stood out to me in my career working in the justice system, it is frankly, in a lot of ways, the degree to which I think our civic education in the country is really poor. And basic things that people in my view probably should understand about what their rights are, or how the system works, or what their lawyer is supposed to do, or what the police do, or what the prosecutor is supposed to do, which are things that are kind of the very building blocks of the system where I work. Sometimes it really seems the degree of the lack of knowledge people have, people that are adults, people that are competent people have about those things, I think makes it more difficult for everybody to navigate through. And there's a lot of situations where if there was better civic education, I think it would then foster more trust in the system. When the work, if everyone understands what everyone else is supposed to be doing, well then you're more likely to have trust and confidence when those things are happening, right? Like if you know what they're supposed to do, and then you can see they're mostly doing it, well, you feel better about what you're seeing than if it is if you don't really know and you're kind of guessing and then it doesn't really make sense. Like when things are a mystery, right, because you don't understand, because for whatever reason, that education never happened, well then something that, could put your liberty at stake, that we're never really taught about, it's very likely you're going to be distrustful of that thing, right?
Well, and it certainly makes holding people accountable, do a better job at that when you know what your rights are and what the obligations of others are. Absolutely.
I mean, and so, I think civic education in the country could be improved, and that would improve trust. And there's something else, I'm working on a project now, and, with some other people in the community, and a lot of times I think that in a lot of ways, I think that there's times when there's conflict, sometimes that'll create airtime, sell newspapers or whatever, right? That's what sells. And so I think sometimes there's a false dichotomy that gets created where people think, okay, well, you've got to be either for jail incarceration of people in acute crimes, or you have to be for treatment, right? But that's not true. Those two things can support one another, okay? They can support one another, and they can support one another in such a way as to end criminal behavior, and to make it less likely to be more criminal behavior in the future. And so, the space where those two things overlap and they kind of coalesce to result in a safer community is a place where I really think we should explore. At the end of the day, I believe very firmly that sobriety is good for public safety.
I'm sorry, you
Sobriety is good for public safety. And generally speaking, treatment helps with sobriety, right? But it's also been my experience, and a lot of times, dealing with things like fentanyl and heroin and methamphetamine addiction, and those are all, things we see often, that when you're out there and you have like a treatment sign, you're saying, come over here for treatment, well, okay, people that are in the throes of addiction probably aren't going to willingly go, right? And there's going to sometimes have to be a dramatic intervention for then the path towards sobriety and towards recovery to be able to improve.
I just want to say, I'm going to guess that the League of Women Voters is wholeheartedly agrees with you that civic education, stronger civic education would be a very good thing for all of us to engage in. Okay, so we got some questions here. I've got a couple that I think are sort of getting at the same thing. Do you think the public would benefit from public disclosure of police conduct? And why is it so hard to share, an officer who's done misconduct record? So basically, I think these questions are getting at the public's desire to know when there has been an episode of misconduct by a law enforcement officer, and would we be better served if there was more transparency about, or even data collection on officer misconduct? And I realize none of you are police officers, so maybe this is a challenging question, to throw at you, but it's clearly something that this room is interested in. So any thoughts on that, on making it easier for the public to know when officers have been cited for misconduct?
Well, I think it depends a little bit on what the allegation is and what the evidence is and what the findings were and how those things play out. So, I'd have to know more specifically exactly what it is that people were seeking to know. But very broadly speaking, I think the technology where these things are memorialized and we can see them clearly is a good thing. And I think that the steps that need to be taken to ensure that things are transparent should be taken. I have a lot of confidence in my work with Jeff and with Brad that when people want to see those videos, they want to try to see things, that they have procedures in place, and it's, in my view, it's pretty appropriate. They do what they can to try to support transparency and the credibility of everybody involved.
It's my understanding, though, that it's hard to track occurrences of police misconduct from a data perspective when officers move across the country, because to get to Reverend Franklin's issue of consistency, there's no consistent tracking of that. I believe there is some legislation in Congress right now, the George Floyd policing bill, that would try to streamline, I think, that data tracking so that there was more transparency about an officer who's had a misconduct charge but then tried to go somewhere else to get hired. I don't know if you know.
Well, I think you're right. There is legislation, that's on that, and I'm unaware presently of the status.
I'm sorry?
I'm not sure what happened to it. But I know that was a subject that came up, and I know there is a bill being pursued on it. But that's the extent of my knowledge on that subject.
All right. Let's see here. Yeah, I'm trying to be sensitive to the fact that you guys are not police officers, so I don't want to ask you too many police questions, right? So one of the most disturbing issues presented at Just Mercy is the number of people with mental illness who are incarcerated. What are we doing locally to reduce that number and to be sure that the right help is available and provided? So Brent, you talked about the importance of treatment, and that you see that going hand in hand with the work that you do. Are there any particular programs or initiatives in the community right now for the mentally ill that you think is important for the community to know about?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's been some work in recent years. For a long time, and presently I'm very involved with, we have a successful drug court, and in essence that tries to have a partnership with both the traditional justice system and incarceration with treatment. And by, kind of exercising that space where they both are to help people in neighborhoods become safer by virtue of helping people obtain sobriety, but also having public safety. And using that model, there's been efforts with the prosecutor's office, with the judicial system, courts, law enforcement, probation, to try to have something similar, to bring something similar on board, in regards to mental health. And so if we have a situation and we can figure out that somebody has a formal mental health diagnosis, then what we attempt to do is we attempt to find a way to use treatment so that the person is less likely to engage in further criminal conduct, less likely to be in jail. And that's something that also, there's origins now, we're trying to put together that mental health court, like the drug court. I know the Superior Court 1 judge is working on that. We're trying to get that together, and that's got the support of a lot of people within the justice system. And so, those are two ways in which we're trying to do those things. And CIT training that I mentioned previously that law enforcement's had really is a great tool, and it's really a great tool to de-escalate those situations.
changing nature of the Hancock County community. And I know the League of Women Voters sent me some stats on Hancock County and your population, but I've not seen it in my big mix here. But I know that this has largely been historically a very homogenous community, a very white community. But with each census, those numbers are changing. So the question that we have here is what, and I'm thinking, Reverend Franklin, this is directed more for you, but what would you like to see mostly white communities like ours doing over the next 5 to 10 years so that the non-white community feels safe and can trust the criminal justice system? I think the larger community. I know that's a big one. If you're not comfortable answering that, that is okay. You can tell me to pass.
For Hancock County, you said?
Yeah, the community's changing. What needs do you see? What would you like to see the white community doing in Hancock County to be more welcoming, I think, and to create more trust?
I think people just have to see each other. We have rally days. I think, I'm not sure it happened last year because of COVID, and I like to see, and the white people can't do it by themselves. Black people have to come. And so the word has to get out that the community wants to reach out and to be welcoming. But it would have to be, I would think, more activities that are inclusive of everyone. And that's why it's happening. Certain things might be happening. I mean, I'm sure you hear Hancock County, I know there's fairs, there's whatever, and just announcements that maybe there's a dialogue session, one of the buildings maybe at the county fair or something like that, but there's got to be a way where the people can come together and understand. Advertisement is good. Look at media. We have media left and right now coming at us 3D, so there has to be ways that says we welcome everyone in Hancock County. And everyone has to understand that that's going to be said about where they live. Someone made a statement to me a few weeks ago that they heard that Section 8 housing was going to be constructed here. And they said, what's Greenfield going to look like when Section 8 housing comes? Well, the OO means that if people qualify for Section 8, they're usually minorities, people of color. So, that mindset needs to be helped and dealt with, and again, dialogue is doing it. We'll do some part and have some part in helping people to understand. Don't be afraid of poor people. Look at what we're talking about. The poor here, people who have less income, and find out why. Some people weren't able to go to school or weren't able to go down the lane that would help them to be more successful in life and to earn more. So maybe for now they qualify for Section 8. But Section 8 is also out here coming up, and they're trying not to look like they belong in a poverty section of town. They received a lot of complaints, and I read something not long ago, I don't know what it was in, that you don't know what Section 8 looks like in some neighborhoods, what house is Section 8, what isn't, and again, dialogue.
Yeah. Now, like I said, we need to be at things where we see each other. I'm a big believer that the more we see each other, the more we get to know each other, the better we can then show up for each other. And ultimately, that's what a community is, right? It's people showing up for each other. It's understanding that my neighbor is as important to me as anybody else. So I think I agree with you there. I think that's very important. So in the book, more than the movie, but the book, Brian Stevenson tells about several children who are sentenced to life in prison without parole. Do we have protections for children who commit crimes? I'm interested in that, but then also, Gina, given the fact that you work with youth, I realize they're 18, probably would hate to be called children, but you are working with children. Did that section of the book resonate with the youth that you work with, this idea that there are children who are sentenced to basically, death through life imprisonment?
Definitely. My students were very concerned about those parts of the book, and some of them came in asking why we were reading this book because they were crying when they were reading them at home. students, the conversation has been interesting about those chapters because, some students can totally get on board with saying that absolutely no people under the age of 18 should be sentenced to life without parole, but then, you hear standalone stories that are of like a super vicious crime committed by a 16-year-old, and then they're like, well, I don't believe in this, but maybe I should make an exception for someone like this. So it's led to some really interesting conversations. I feel like it's hard to get them to, it's good, they engage a lot in the conversation, but it's hard to get them to take a stance on something and hold to it. But we're still working our way through that part of the book, so we'll see in the next few days what they have to say about it.
How much time do you, I'm just curious, how much time do you spend in the classroom with the book?
We have been reading it since, we're in a 9-week course right now because of COVID, we changed to quarters instead of semesters. So we've been reading the book since week 3, so that would have been the beginning of April, I believe. We discussed 3 chapters every Friday.
Oh, okay. This question, this is actually, maybe some advice that can be given to folks. It says most calls to 911 are not for crimes or even violent behavior, but oftentimes might involve someone who is personally ill. How else can we respond to these kinds of things? I think that's a great question. I mean, 911 is the thing that we're told to call in an emergency, but not all emergencies are equal. I don't know. Do we think, Brent, do you have any suggestions on other?
If you are immediate health in a serious or potential terminal way is an issue, call 911. If you are in a situation where you reasonably believe that there's a need for an emergency response by either EMTs, fire, or law enforcement due to something that is happening in present time, call 911. If it is not a medical emergency, or it's something that does not appear to be a situation where there is an imminent necessity of a response of that type, then call the non-emergency number. There's been occasions like when I've been, in places in public and somebody's mentioned something that may have happened that they were aware of, maybe the day before, right? And there's not anything imminent, but they think they may have information for law enforcement about potential crime or something has occurred. I encourage them to contact law enforcement on the non-emergency numbers. And so that way it frees those lines up so that if there is an emergency, if there's a crash or there's a fire or somebody has a medical emergency, then that's free for them to do those things. We're blessed with our 911 center and the hardworking people there that work all the time to make sure that those messages get out. They're categorized correctly so law enforcement has an idea what they're getting into. And so those folks are, I think, oftentimes an overlooked part of our team, in public safety. But very generally, it is not an emergency, don't call 911. And if I can go back to 2 questions ago, because I took some notes on it, and one of the things that, you mentioned, well, how can Hancock County be welcoming? How can it be a good place? Well, we got to see each other individuals, right? We got to meet each other where we are. One of the things that I think we talked about. I mean, the other thing, is I think that the most, as prosecutor, obviously, my perspective is going to be the most fundamental human right is the right to be free of violence and be free of, being killed or injured. And so if you have a community that is generally going to be safe and is going to respect other people's person, and other people's safety, and other people's lives, then it follows that is going to be a place where all people should be able to go and feel safe. And that's what I've dedicated my career to. It's something I've got tremendous passion about. And, I know I work daily with law enforcement, and all of us collectively want to do what we can to ensure that people feel safe in their homes. And that's kind of the most, fundamental right anyone can have. And if we're able to successfully do that for everybody across the board in our community, regardless of whatever status or category we want to put them in, then I think that we're doing a good job.
Well, I think we're coming up on about an hour, and I realize it's getting late, it's a work night and that sort of thing. So I think what I'd like to end with is, we opened this with a conversation about that excerpt from the book, and all of you pointed to the fact that poverty should be broadly defined. And then there was also some conversation that hopelessness is a real concern, that hopelessness can breed a lot of the inequity that we see and a lot of the unfairness that we see in this world. So right now, in this moment, when it comes to race and criminal justice, race and law enforcement, how are y'all feeling? Are you feeling hopeful? Are you feeling a little despondent? Or are you just sort of treading water right now?
I can start. Some of my students, when I asked them how they felt about the book when they were done with it last quarter, some of them felt hopeless because they're like, there's so many problems. How are we supposed to fix all these things? When I read the book, and I think some of the students in my class also felt this way, I felt motivated, I would say, because I thought that instead of just feeling generally hopeless, it gave me certain things that I can advocate for. Like I can make a list of the things that I would like to see changed because of the book. So I think that it was a good starting point for making changes to hopefully better the system.
Thank you. Mr. Patty, how about you? Feeling hopeful, motivated, something else right now?
Every day begins with hope.
I'm sorry?
Every day begins with hope.
Okay.
I mean, every day begins with the hope that today can be better than yesterday and tomorrow can be better still. And, you know, as you grow in life and you have relationships with people and as you have a community that we're fortunate enough to be in a place where it's safe. We're fortunate enough to be in a place where people want to come to, where people want to live. We're fortunate enough to be in a place where, you know, the schools are well respected. You know, we're fortunate enough to be in a place where, you know, presently, generally speaking, your children can play, right? And you can go to the store without fear of violence. And, you know, one of the things that is true from whenever there's hardship or whenever there's challenge, challenges don't necessarily build character, they reveal it, right? And one of the things that's, you know, is true with that is that it shows us an opportunity and it finds us ways to get better. And, you know, if anything comes from, you know, the dialogue, I certainly hope that we're able to improve education on these very important subjects. And, you know, then we can work together so that there's greater trust, because from trust comes a place where, you know, there's less mistrust and less incidents that we want to avoid.
Reverend Franklin?
Yeah, I'm hopeful. I think when we're made aware of something, we should do something about it, or contact people who we feel can do something or can begin to implement changes. So you have to go forward, and I mean, even this, what we're doing here tonight, yeah, that would give birth to hope. And prayerfully, people will talk about it, and if people feel like they are helpless to do anything, you know, we can all just, again, talk with our families, those closest to us, and for those who do, we can pray, continue to pray.
Well, I want to thank you all for being here tonight. I also want to thank the League of Women Voters for Hancock County for bringing this book to the community, bringing the movie here tonight, and inspiring, I think, you know, the greater Hancock County area to embrace these difficult conversations and to begin to see each other so you can start showing up for each other and being that welcome and inclusive place. And I want to point out, we need to thank Indiana Humanities, which was the main funder for all of the work that the League of Women Voters has been doing. And we certainly want to thank Brent's Theater, New Palestine High School, and some other high schools that have been working with the League. It's really been a pleasure for me to see how many partners are involved in this project to do this really important work. So is there anything else you'd like to share?
I want to thank all the panelists again, and I want to thank you, Erin, for being here. And our pleasure for all of you taking time out of your busy schedules to be here for us. And to the audience, I'd like to also thank you for participating. And if you have filled out the program or survey or something, please leave that on the table to the right as you go out the door.